If you haven't watched my video on Oracle of Ages first, you should probably go do that real quick, since this is part 2 in what I guess you can call the Oracle saga of games.
Part 2? Part 2, part 2, part 2!
Yeah, well, anyways, ItsGheb here, welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to the series of videos where we're covering every single Legend of Zelda game. Last time I covered Oracle of Ages, and that video is essentially required material for this one, as they are sister games to one another. Long story short for that video, I enjoyed it. It's far from my favorite Zelda game, but I think it's still a pretty damn fine addition to the franchise, and I was happy to finally experience it. This time though, we're covering the other Oracle game with The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons, and yeah, this one's kind of interesting to talk about. Reason being is that the Oracle games are both designed with the ability to be played by themselves, but also interact with each other to act as a complete story. You could in theory play just one of these games, but it'd be kind of like playing Sonic and Knuckles without playing Sonic 3. You're just missing out on the intended experience. No, these games are meant to be played one after the other, which is exactly what I did here. So now that I have the full experience under my belt, what can I say not just about Oracle of Seasons, but both of the Oracle games in general? Well, in terms of Oracle of Seasons, I have to say that there are a few things that I think I preferred in this game, but overall, I would say that Ages comes out ever so slightly ahead in my eyes. And I'll also just say that if you prefer Seasons to Ages, I can totally see why, but I think more stuff resonated with me in Ages personally. Don't get me wrong though, Seasons is also a great game, and as an overall package, these games provide some really cool interactivity, plenty of reasons for doing multiple playthroughs, and provide more of that classic 2D Zelda feel, but playing these games back to back was also a little bit exhausting if I'm being honest. Again, I had a pretty positive experience with both of the Oracle games overall, so much so in fact that if I got to pick the next game that Nintendo would remake, I would probably pick these two. But what is it about this game that really makes me say that? Well, we have a lot to discuss today. So without further ado, this is my review for The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons. This time around, we're going to skip right past the audio and the visuals because it's really just more of the same. Maybe you could say Seasons looks slightly better with its more varied color palette, but for the most part, they're pretty comparable. However, what's not really a one-to-one comparison is the story. And in this case, that's not exactly a good thing, so let's get into that real quick. So this time around, Link finds himself in another far-off land called Holodrum, where shortly after his arrival, he meets with a dancer by the name of Din, who we find out is the Oracle of Seasons. And almost immediately after we are introduced, she gets hit with a tornado. Bummer. This was sent by General Onyx, our main villain for the adventure, who we won't actually see again until the end of the game. Huh. He kidnaps Din and stores her inside of a crystal, and then sends all the seasons in Holodrum to go completely out of whack, changing what was once a peaceful fantasy world into your average county in the Midwest. Okay, maybe Onyx might be the most diabolical villain that we've seen in the franchise yet, I don't know. Link then meets up with Impa, who tells him to visit the Maku tree in Horon Village. This time the Maku tree looks closer to Wispy Woods than the Great Deku tree, but then he instructs Link to find the 8 essences of nature in order to confront Onyx. And one standard Zelda Collectathon montage later, you do just that and bring peace to Holodrum. And if it sounds like I'm skipping on details, I'm not. This is the most bog standard basic Zelda plot that we've seen since Zelda 2. And while I didn't think the story for Oracle of Ages was spectacular or anything, at least there was a story. Like, there are some things of the story that are okay, I guess, like Holodrum as a setting for an example. It's about on par with Labyrinth from Oracle of Ages, maybe slightly better in some areas, I guess. And the reason for that doesn't have anything to do with Holodrum himself, actually, because outside of the absence of Queen Ambi, I couldn't tell you a specific thing about Holodrum that makes it unique from the world that I just went through when I played Oracle of Ages. No, it's a land underneath called Subrosia that has some more interesting ideas. This is essentially a subterranean kingdom filled with a group of people called the Subrosians that have their own sort of culture. They use different currencies. All the items that they have are upside down in stores. And Subrosians are also these weird Jawa looking things. I think the coolest thing about this area that some landmarks such as the pirate ship and of course the Temple of Seasons have fallen into the area from Holodrum that creates this kind of contrast between the two different worlds. And I will say too, even if it is kind of limited, the writing that we get from a lot of the side characters does keep up the pace with what we saw in Oracle of Ages. Given the limited graphical capabilities of the Game Boy Color, these two games really needed to work with the few animations and sound effects they had, as well as the writing in order to get their tone across. It's kind of like being on stage for a play and you have to magnify your movements in order to convey something to people far in the back of the crowd. And again, much like what I said about Oracle of Ages, the humor here is good, even if it's a bit more few and far between than that game. We also see a lot of returning faces again from Ocarina of Time, such as the Windmill Guy, Talon, Malon, and Ingo. And I don't know if this is like a common consensus or not, but I personally like seeing these familiar faces come up time and time again in these games. Beyond that though, there really isn't much to talk about here. There just isn't anything that happens in this story. After you get your initial quest, that's all you do with basically no complications until the end of the game. Like, at least Ages had the whole Queen Ambi possession segment. There really isn't anything comparable here, and I think part of that reason is because this game doesn't really have any characters. Like, we get Din and Onyx introduced at the beginning of the game, and then Din gets turned into a crystal, and Onyx doesn't really appear again until the final encounter. Like, I didn't think Varen was an amazing villain or anything, but at least she showed up and did stuff every now and again. Onyx just sits in his castle until the end of the game. He may as well just be an Iron Knuckle who decided to talk one day for all that he matters. Other than those two, we don't really have any other characters to talk about. It's seriously that bare bones. So okay, the story here, kind of a miss even when compared with Oracle of Ages. This is a little disappointing to see, but it was also never really the focus on this game, opting to have a bigger emphasis on action and gameplay, so maybe the gameplay portion of this video will be a little bit better. Oh, but wait, we've got linked story content to talk about. And I know what you're thinking. Isn't every Zelda game technically a linked story, since he's pretty much the main character every time? Shut up. Okay, but what you might actually be wondering is how does the story ultimately change during the linked playthrough? Wouldn't I technically need to play the game on a normal run and a linked run in order to spot the differences? No. Yeah, the linked editions are very obvious. You get the more subtle stuff like some characters such as the pirates or animal companions recognizing Link from the last game, and actually even characters like Nehru and Queen Ambi show up for some cameos, which I thought was cool. It kind of makes me wonder who would show up if I did a linked playthrough of Ages, since this game was so light on new characters, but I digress. Each game also has some more specific additions, such as Seasons having Queen Ambi return to find her sailor lover, or having Zelda being robbed by King Moblin from Oracle of Ages. Oh yeah, Zelda's in the linked playthrough too. She gets kidnapped in either game that you play second, and is being used as a potential vessel for Twin Rova to revive Ganon. Yeah, that's really our end game here. Varen and Onyx light two of the three flames, and Twin Rova attempts to sacrifice Zelda in order to bring Ganon back. But the resurrection is botched when Zelda is saved, and Twin Rova tries to become a host instead, only for Ganon to become a mindless monster. You dispatch of him almost immediately, and then bring peace to both Holodrum and Labrynna, before making your way on a ship for another adventure. But yeah, these plot additions are pretty obvious when they come up. And you know, they were essentially designed to be slotted in and out of the main story, depending on if you were doing a linked playthrough or not, so you're not really missing that much by not seeing all of these things. Like, don't get me wrong, these are cool, but outside of the final dungeon and few boss fights, the only thing that really changes story-wise is purely for extra flavor. Which is fine, I love having the recognition of playing both games, but I wasn't exactly telling myself I need to go back and do a linked playthrough of the other games anytime soon, you know? I will say, I'm glad that I did end up doing a linked playthrough for Seasons between the two games because, man, that base story was dry. And this did at least add a little bit to spice things up. Still, it's cool that Capcom ended up making 4 different types of playthroughs for these games. It's not enough to make me want to go play through these games again immediately, but I do appreciate the effort. And the next time I do come back to the Oracle games, at least I'll have a slightly different way of experiencing them, which is always nice. Alright, and now we'll actually get to talk about the gameplay, for as little differences as there actually are. Again, both of the Oracle games are built off the foundation of Link's Awakening, so they're basically like 99% the same, so I'll really only have to get into detail on a few things here that are notably different between the two Oracle games. First up is inventory, and both of these games share pretty much the same inventory, but there are a couple of notable differences too. The worst of these has to be the slingshot. This essentially is the same thing as the seed launcher from Ages, but now you can't ricochet shots, which loses a ton of utility. I mean, when you get it upgraded, you do get a triple shot, which is kind of handy, especially for some combat sections, but for the most part, I think this is the weaker of the two. Next is the Rock's Cape, which is an upgraded version of the Rock's Feather. This gives Link the ability to glide a very short distance, allowing him to clear larger gaps. This item is awesome, especially when paired with the Pegasus Seed. It almost feels like you're breaking the game with how much you can get away with. I love this thing. They need to bring this ability to glide back in another Zelda game. Okay, you got me there. And finally, we have the magnetic gloves. Now, these things are just really fucking cool. They essentially give Link the ability to either pull or push objects towards or away from him, but it also works the same way for Link against stationary objects. This shows up in some fun puzzle, area traversal, and even some combat segments later on in the game. This is just a really unique and fun item. We really need to see this make a comeback again too, because there's a lot of potential here. And no, Magnesis from Breath of the Wild does not count. Nice try. The items and seasons come out a little bit stronger than Ages in my opinion. Can't 100% say the same thing about the dungeons. Now these dungeons aren't bad, but I feel like they lack some of the novelty that the Oracle of Ages dungeons had. Structurally, they're fine for the most part, well, except for a few of the dungeons that have minecarts. One thing I find annoying is that there's no way to call the minecart back to its original spot if you were to find a different route through the dungeon, meaning you would have to backtrack to the area that you left the minecart if you wanted to go somewhere in particular. Like, I know it was the same way in Ages, but I never noticed it due to the way that the dungeons in that game were laid out. But it happened to me a couple times in this game, which was definitely enough to be a little annoying. On an aesthetical level, most of these dungeons also really didn't do it for me. The best dungeon in my eyes is probably the Sword and Shield Maze, which is, surprise, a dungeon in Subrosia. You get to throw these crystals from one floor into these lava pits below to cool it down so it solidifies, which is a pretty fun mechanic. Outside of that though, I don't really remember too much about this game's dungeons. We don't even have a dungeon like Mermaid Cave that had to switch between time periods, since I assumed we were going to have some season switching dungeon at the very least. Well, on the bright side, I'll say at least traversing the overworld at least feels a little bit smoother in Seasons than it does in Ages. This time around, it feels like the world is far better connected, and there doesn't seem to be as much item switching as necessary in order to get from location to location. There aren't a whole lot of memorable locations outside of Subrosia or the pirate ship, but at least with how the world is laid out, it feels much more easily traversable. And that's not to say you still won't be doing any item switching in the overworld, but it just seems to be a lot less common, especially in areas that you're retreading through. So yeah, when it comes to general gameplay, it's more of what you can expect from the Game Boy Legend of Zelda games, which is a pretty solid experience. Then comes the side content, which, believe it or not, I think I prefer what we have here in this game over what we got in Ages. I'll keep this portion rather brief. So first off, you'll still see a lot of side content from Ages also make an appearance here, from heart pieces to another trading side quest that gets you a sword upgrade, to optional objectives that will strengthen other equipment such as your shield. Of course, the gacha seeds come back, and of course I still don't care about them. And finally, we also see the return of the ring system with a different selection to potentially get. I will say there are a couple of cool different ways of getting rings too, such as the quest where you hunt down golden Giga Chad variants of enemies, so things like that were cool to see. I think the more interesting thing to discuss when it comes to the side content is just how different the approach for Seasons is than what we saw in Oracle of Ages. See, in that game, you had about 8 minigames or so you could do, with some of them even being necessary for story completion. This was something we started to see more and more of as the series was progressing, with games like Majora's Mask having nearly 20 minigames to pick from. But even as far back as the original Legend of Zelda on the NES, we still had some minigames, but the big focus on side content back then was more on discovering secrets. And I think that's what Oracle of Seasons really tries to get back to. We only have 2 mini-games here, the treasure chest one in Horon Village and the dancing minigame in Subrosia, which is infinitely less annoying than the Goron dancing game in Ages, I promise you. Instead, Oracle of Seasons' main attraction would be all the secret grottos that you can find where you'll get rewarded for rupees for your curiosity. It's obviously way easier to find these than it was in Zelda 1, since it's clearly communicated on where they could potentially be, and admittedly, there really isn't that much to spend your rupees on, especially after you get the 3 items from the members only area of the store, but hey, there's something, I guess. Alright, let's get into some more of the defining mechanics of Oracle of Seasons, and what better place to start with than the thing that's in the title. So yeah, much like how Oracle of Ages had you switching back and forth between 2 overworlds taking place in separate time periods, this game will have you swap the seasons around thanks to a new item called the Rod of Seasons in order to access new areas that Link couldn't otherwise. I don't like it as much. Alright, it's not like it's an objectively worse mechanic or anything. In fact, let me talk about some of the things I like. So first off, the concept is way more cool and original than another game about time travel. I know you can technically say this is time travel since we're changing the time of year, but the way that it shows up in gameplay feels closer to altering the weather than anything else. Second, the aesthetical changes to the overworld are really pleasing on the eyes, and it makes you want to see what areas might look like in other seasons. It's hard for me to pick a favorite since they all look so visually distinct from one another. Even when swapping between spring and summer, which I thought were just going to have too much overlap, there were still things that stood out from each other there. And lastly, the gameplay changes that each of the seasons provide are pretty interesting. There are less overall variation between the 4 seasons map to the 2 ages ones, but they still have some mechanical differences. Winter will have a lot of water freeze over, many trees will lose their leaves creating new paths, and large snowbanks will form that will make ramps. Spring will have certain rivers flood and have flowers that Link can use to shoot himself up to higher elevations. Summer will have some of the watery areas experience a drought and have vines grow on walls. And finally, autumn will have pits covered by fallen leaves providing passage, and certain mushrooms can be picked in order to open new paths. Now I really do like what's here. I think a little bit more could have been done though. Some of the seasons feel like they have a bit more mechanically to offer than others, with winter having the most clear and understandable distinction of the 4. I would have maybe liked to see a bit more variety here. Like maybe in fall there's some dead trees that have fallen over to allow Link to pass certain gaps, or in spring having an occasional breeze that would mess with the trajectory of items like the boomerang or slingshot. I don't know, man. Compared to Oracle of Ages, where I thought that mechanic really iterated on what other Zelda games had already done, this one kind of feels like it leaves a couple things on the table. Also, the method of getting new seasons and even changing them isn't really on the same level as what we saw in Ages. So initially when you start the game, some of the areas will be locked to a particular season and others will cycle through them when you exit and re-enter a location. Upon getting the Rod of Seasons, you can only change things to winter at first, but over the course of the next few dungeons, you'll collect the rest of the seasons. Once you have all of them, outside of going for optional content, you won't really be changing things around too much. The most involved it gets is right before the 6th dungeon, Ancient Ruins, and this is legitimately a great section of the game, and it almost feels like a mini dungeon that takes place in the overworld, which I think is really cool. But this is about the height of the season switching that we get. We don't have any dungeon that requires it, which is kind of a shock to me, and I think worst of all is the method that we are required to go about changing the seasons. So first off, you have to find these stumps which you need to stand on in order to use the rod. But instead of making a selection on which season you change to, you cycle through them until you get to the one you want. It's not the worst system in the world, but it makes the process a little bit more clunky than it probably should be. Also, being limited to only changing the seasons on the stumps isn't as cool as being able to go back and forth between 2 different time periods whenever you want. Don't get me wrong, this is still a really cool and fun mechanic. I just think it's a little bit better done in Ages than in Seasons. The difference between the 2 time periods were a lot more noticeable, and the progression from having to find time portals to being able to travel through time at will was really rewarding. Based off only aesthetics and originality, the season changings get some points from me, but I think the time traversal was just a better realized system overall. So the other thing that everyone says that Oracle of Seasons focuses on is the action and the combat. But does it really? You know, going into this game, I didn't really know what to expect in terms of a focus on action. Like, I heard that Oracle of Ages had a greater emphasis on puzzles, and I just assumed that they were going to be a little bit more tricky and a little bit more frequent, and for the most part, I was right. But that game still obviously had combat and action segments, so where does that leave Oracle of Seasons? Honestly, it doesn't really feel like there's that much more action here. Like, there might be a few more sections and dungeons that have your standard kill every enemy in the room challenge, but there were still a good amount of puzzles here too. Like this one where you have to move a trampoline to certain areas to bounce up floors, or this ice block pushing one. These are puzzles that still require a bit more thought than your average Zelda puzzle at the time, so it was kind of weird seeing that the action-focused Zelda game still had puzzles like this show up. Well, maybe the combat is supposed to be a bit more challenging, and that could be it. I will say I definitely died more in this game than I did in Ages, but the weird thing is that I can't really pinpoint what was more challenging. Were there more enemies? I mean, technically yeah, but for the most part, that really only amounts to having different colored variations of enemies that we've already seen before that are slightly more beefed up. Are the bosses tougher? Well, I guess so, since these bosses are a lot more like ones from the earlier Zelda games that require you looking for openings for sword swings instead of relying on the dungeon item. Side note, I did think it was really cool that the majority of bosses in this game were remixed versions of boss fights that we had from Zelda 1. That was a really cool thing to see. I don't know, maybe the challenge came from having a few more platforming segments? Like, look at this shit. What is this, a Mega Man game? Oh yeah, huh. Look, it's clear that these games aren't one-to-one the same or anything, but for this to be the more action-oriented Zelda game, it's hard to really put my finger on what makes it more action-oriented, you know? To me, instead of a combat or action-oriented Zelda game, this feels more like an updated version of Zelda 1 that decided to be a little bit more linear, which, you know, when you factor in that this game started its life as a remake of Zelda 1, that kind of makes a bit of sense. So here we are, the main gimmick about both of the Oracle games, in the fact that you can link them together and have them interact with each other. So, what does this look like? Well, starting off, you will need to make your selection between either ages or seasons as to which game to play first. Upon completing either of these games, you'll be given a code at the end of the credits that you can input into the other game to start a linked playthrough file. You can of course also use 2 Game Boy Colors and a link cable if you're somehow watching this video from back in 2001, but most people who play these games today will probably just use the password system. This unlocks a new type of file to play, where Link will now begin his adventure with 4 heart containers, as well as either a sword or a shield depending on which version of the game you play second. And that's just starting off. These games interact with each other a lot more as you go on. During a linked playthrough, you'll have some stuff that you'd probably expect, such as an altered plot like I mentioned earlier, or some items being shuffled around for story progression, and probably one of the most notable changes being the Hero's Cave going from a small tutorial area in one game to a massive super challenging endgame dungeon in the linked version. The most interesting feature you're going to find is the secrets between both of these games though. So during your linked run, you will occasionally find an NPC that wouldn't be there in the original version, and when you speak to them, they will give you a code that you can take back to the other game and give it to an NPC so they can give you an exclusive new item. This can be anything from seed and bomb capacity upgrades, additional heart containers, the big Goron sword, bomb shoes, the final ring box upgrade, the mirror shield. Hell, this is even how you get the master sword this time around, in what's probably its most nonchalant showing. But the cool thing is, after you get this item in the first game, that NPC will also give you another password that you can use to bring over to the second game. You then go inside the Maku tree in your linked playthrough and speak to Furore to input the code, and she gives you a chest with that item. See, we actually do have a third Oracle to coincide with the goddesses after all. Neru, the Oracle of Ages, Din, the Oracle of Seasons, and Furore, the Oracle of Password bitch. It's a little clunky, I guess, going back and forth between games in order to get these passwords, but, you know, it is what it is. You can even trade the rings back and forth between games too, which is surprisingly useful since you actually have a higher amount of ring slots with the last upgrade, so you can sort of justify putting on some of those more niche picks. This is undoubtedly a very cool and ambitious feature. It's by far the most interesting mechanic that the Oracle games have to offer, even if it is a little bit clunky by modern standards. If this game was remade today, I'd imagine it'd be just as simple as having one game read whatever save data you have on your Switch, which hey, if Nintendo or Grezzo or whoever wanted to take a stab at it, it'd be something I really like to see. Last little bit before we wrap this video up, and I thought a good spot to end things on would be, what is some of the new content that the linked playthrough actually brings in, and what's the reward for the player? So after landing the final blow on either Varan or Onyx, depending on your playthrough, Link will be transported to the final dungeon, the Room of Rights. And I call it a dungeon, but it's more just a series of rooms that will have the player pick one of 4 paths, depending on which way the statue's eyes aren't facing. This will lead to a boss fight with Koame and Katake, which plays pretty similarly to their encounter in Ocarina of Time, but you'll use your sword to smack the projectiles back instead of the mirror shield. So this is what that baseball minigame was preparing me for. It all makes sense now. Well anyways, I cheesed this fight by sitting over here in the corner and spamming sword strikes until the RNG gods blessed me, and then we move into Twin Rova, which is a much more interesting encounter. Dodge the attack, slash until she splits apart, hit her with that sweet, sweet mystery seed, and then we have probably the most lackluster boss fight with Ganon in the series. Yeah, there really isn't too much to this fight. Like, the only attack you have to watch out for is this one where he flips your controls, which you can definitely take a lot of damage from if you aren't careful. So with the final bosses out of the way, what exactly do you get for completing a linked playthrough of the Oracle games? Well, you actually get something called the Hero Game. This essentially will allow you to play through the standard non-linked version of the game you just played, but with the addition of getting an extra heart container and being able to transfer over your rings from either of the two previous games. Upon completing that run, you can then do a linked playthrough of the very first game you played in this saga, so you'll be able to experience everything that both of the Oracle games have to offer. Given that your linked playthroughs are very similar to the standard version, I'm really only going to advise doing this if you are absolutely in love with these games and you can't get enough of them. Otherwise, I think doing things the way that I did will probably get you your fill here. Alright, so now that I've finished Oracle of Seasons, as well as a linked playthrough to complete the Oracle Saga, what do I think of these games? Starting off with Oracle of Seasons, I think this game was a pretty good time. I thought traversing the world was fun, the new items were some of the most interesting in the series so far, and even if the seasons mechanic wasn't as fleshed out as I wanted it to be, it was still a really cool idea to experience Holodrum in multiple different ways. But how does it compare to Oracle of Ages? Well, if I'm being honest with you, I think you can't really go wrong with picking up either of these games, especially if you're a fan of what Link's Awakening had to offer. But if I had to pick between the two, I'd give the edge to Ages. I thought the story was a bit more entertaining, the time travel was more well realized, and the emphasis on puzzles did a better job of making its presence known than Oracle of Seasons' apparent focus on action. You know, when thinking about the Oracle games, it's kind of a fun showcase to see how much the series has changed since 1986. Oracle of Seasons really feels like a callback to the original Zelda in a lot of ways, from the remix boss fights to all the grottos for extra rupees to the story taking a back seat. It feels closer to a classic Zelda title than most other Zelda games do. On the flip side, Oracle of Ages has a more in-depth story, lots of minigames, and more focus on dungeon puzzles that seems closer to something we would find in Majora's Mask or Ocarina of Time. The time travel mechanic also feels a bit more in line with those two games. You know, I think instead of saying that the Oracle games either focus on puzzles or action, a more appropriate way of saying things is that Oracle of Seasons appeals more towards classic Zelda fans who have an affinity towards Zelda 1, while Oracle of Ages is a bit closer to something like Ocarina of Time. This makes a bit of sense considering I lean more towards Ages anyways, but maybe that's just me. Regardless, these games are meant to be played one after the other, and you know, when looking at the overall experience, I have to say, I had a pretty good time. When it's all said and done, I think it's pretty safe for me to say that I recommend both of these games. There's a lot to love here, especially if you're looking for more of that classic 2D Zelda formula. I wouldn't say it's on the same level as A Link to the Past or Link's Awakening, but I would put it above Phantom Hourglass or Spirit Tracks from what I've played with those games. Give it a try if you're curious, or maybe hold out until we get a remake somewhere down the line. Seriously, it's either this or Minish Cap that has my money on the next game that's most likely to be remade, but I think more good can be done here, so hopefully we'll see it someday. But that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite memory of The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments section down below. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving a like and subscribing. Thank you guys again. I'll catch you in the next video.